Hi guys, please take really careful notes over the next 2 days because we're going to be talking about causes of World War II, which is setting you up for your classroom-based assessment, your research project, and your research paper. So please carefully listen and record. This will be a special section in your notes. Please label this an economic cause of World War II, just like it states right here in your notebook. The Great Depression. After World War I, Europe was faced with severe economic problems. The most devastating of all was a depression that began in some places in the world as early as 1920, right after the war ended, and in some places as late as 1929, but it affected the entire world. The Great Depression brought misery to millions of people. People were begging for food on the streets, especially when soup kitchens were unable to keep up with demand. More and more people were homeless and moved around looking for work and for shelter. One observer in Germany reported an almost unbroken chain of homeless men extends the whole length of the great Hamburg-Berlin highway. Whole families had piled all their goods into baby carriages and wheelbarrows and were pushing them along, plodding them along in dumb despair. In their misery, some people saw suicide as their only solution. One unemployed person said, "Today, when I am experiencing this for the first time, I think I should prefer to do away with myself, to take gas, to jump into the river, to leap from a high place. Would I really come to such a decision? I don't know." Social unrest spread rapidly, and some of the unemployed staged hunger marches to get attention. In democratic countries, people began to listen and vote for radical voices that called for extreme measures to try to answer their problems. An uneasy peace and an uncertain security. The peace settlement that ended World War I had tried to fulfill 19th century dreams of nationalism by creating a lot of new boundaries and a lot of new states. From the beginning, however, the settlements left many nations unhappy. Border disputes poisoned relations in Eastern Europe for many years. Many Germans vowed to revise the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. A weak League of Nations. President Woodrow Wilson had realized that the peace settlement included unwise provisions that could serve as new causes of conflict. He had placed many hopes for the future in this League of Nations. This organization, however, was not very effective in maintaining peace. One problem was the failure of the United States to even join the League. Most Americans didn't want to be involved in European affairs. The U.S. Senate, despite Wilson's wishes, refused to ratify or approve the Treaty of Versailles, and that meant the United States couldn't be a member of the League of Nations, which automatically weakened the organization's effectiveness. Furthermore, the League could only use economic sanctions, not military force, to stop aggression. French demands. Between 1919 and 1924, a desire for security led the French government to demand strict enforcement of the Treaty of Versailles. This tough policy toward Germany began with the issue of reparations, which were payments that Germany was supposed to make for the damage that they had done in the war. In April of 1921, the Allied Reparations Commission determined that Germany owed 132 billion German marks, which is 33 billion US dollars, for reparation payments, payable in annual installments of 2.5 billion marks a year. The new German Republic made its first payment in 1921. By the following year, however, the German government faced big financial problems, announced it wasn't able to pay anymore. France was outraged and sent troops to occupy something called the Ruhr Valley, Germany's chief industrial and mining center. France planned to collect reparations by operating and using the Ruhr mines and factories. If you look in the top right corner, that red area is the Ruhr Valley. Inflation in Germany. Due to these problems, Germany's economy got absolutely out of control. The German government adopted a policy of passive resistance to French occupation. German workers went on strike. The government mainly paid their salaries by printing more paper money, but this only added to inflation, which is a rise in prices, that had already begun in Germany by the end of the war. The German mark soon became worthless. In 1914, 4.2 marks equaled $1 US. By November 1st, 1923, it took 130 billion marks to equal $1. By the end of November, the ratio had increased to 4.2 trillion marks to equal $1. It was just unbelievable. Evidence of runaway inflation was everywhere. Workers used wheelbarrows to carry home their weekly pay. One woman left a basket of money outside while she went into the store. When she came out, the money was there, but the basket had been stolen. Economic adversity led to political upheavals, and both France and Germany began to seek a way out of the disaster. In August of 1924, an international commission produced a new plan for reparations. The Dawes Plan, named after an American banker who was a chairman of the commission, first reduced reparations. It then coordinated Germany's annual payments with its ability to pay. The Dawes Plan also granted an initial $200 million loan for German recovery. This loan soon opened the door to heavy American investment in Europe. The Treaty of Locarno. With prosperity came a new European diplomacy. A spirit of cooperation was fostered by foreign ministers of Germany and France. A guy named Gustav Strassmann and Aristide Briand in 1925 signed something called the Treaty of Locarno. This guaranteed Germany's new western borders with France and Belgium. The Locarno Pact was viewed by many as the beginning of a new era of European peace. On the day after the pact was concluded, the headlines in the New York Times read, "France and Germany ban war forever." The London Times declared, "Peace at last." This new spirit of cooperation grew even stronger when Germany joined the League of Nations in March of 1926. 2 years later, the Kellogg-Briand Pact brought even more hope. 63 nations signed this accord written by the U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg and the French minister Aristide Briand. These nations pledged to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. Nothing was said, however, about what would be done if anybody violated the pact. Unfortunately, the spirit of Locarno was based on little real substance. Promises not to go to war were worthless without a way to enforce these promises. Furthermore, not even the spirit of Locarno could convince nations to cut back on their weapons. The League of Nations, the Covenant, had suggested that nations reduce their military forces to make war less probable. Germany, of course, had been forced to reduce its military forces due to the Treaty of Versailles. At the time, it was thought that other states would later do the same. But states were simply unwilling to trust their security to anyone but themselves. This will take about 3 minutes and it'll give you an idea of how out of control German hyperinflation was.
Are you complaining about the prices constantly going up? Then you might want to watch this video about one of the most unbelievable cases of hyperinflation in history. That is hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s, where at some point prices doubled almost every 4 days. Hyperinflation occurs when the inflation rate increases very rapidly, resulting in prices going up very fast and the currency losing its value quickly. One of the most amazing hyperinflation cases in history happened in Germany in the 1920s. As the result of World War I, the German paper mark started to lose its value, and this process accelerated in the 1920s. In 1923, prices eventually ran out of control. The prices went up so much that people were forced to spend billions of marks for daily items and were dizzied by the amount of zeros involved. As an example, a loaf of bread which cost 250 marks in January 1923 rose to 200,000 million marks in November of 1923. Or a newspaper that was sold for 1 mark in May 1922 had a price tag of 70 million marks in November 1923. It was cheaper to use the back of a 1 million mark to write notes, as a notepad would cost billions of marks. Some had to use wheelbarrows filled with cash to get a cup of coffee. At restaurants, customers had to negotiate the price of the food in advance, as there was a good chance that the price could change before the meal was served. Most restaurants did not print menus, as by the time the food would arrive, the price had already gone up. At some point, the situation got so bad that the prices were doubling almost every 4 days. There is evidence that it was cheaper to burn marks instead of wood or coal. Some used marks instead of wallpaper to decorate their walls. Children also used bundles of marks instead of toy bricks. Workers also had to negotiate their wages almost on a daily basis. Some had to use a scale to count the weight of their money to get its value, as it was difficult to count all the bills. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend the money quickly before it lost its value. Many collected their wages in suitcases. One person who left his suitcase unattended found that the thief had stolen the suitcase but not the money. After collecting their wages, workers would quickly rush to either buy daily goods or pass the money to their family so that they'd spend it before its value had gone down. The German government eventually managed to stabilize the situation by taking a number of initiatives, including cutting 12 zeros from the paper mark and replacing it with a new currency called Rentenmark. However, the economic pressure on the Germans eventually contributed to the rise of the Nazi Party that used Germany's dire economic situation to attract public support and eventually gain power.
There was a really brief period of prosperity that began in Europe in 1924, in part because the United States had loaned money to them under the Dawes Plan, but it wasn't enough, and soon economic disaster would strike. One of the other things the Treaty of Versailles did was it created 9 new nations in Europe, and this is going to cause some problems because some countries are going to really resent losing that territory, including Russia, who actually lost more territory than most other nations and had been an ally during the war. Causes of the Depression. 2 factors played a major role in the start of the Great Depression. One important factor was a series of downturns in the economies of individual nations in the second half of the 1920s. By the mid-1920s, for example, prices on farm products, especially wheat, were falling really rapidly because of overproduction. The second factor is the coming of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was an international financial crisis involving the U.S. stock market. We've seen that much European prosperity between 1924 and 1929 was built on U.S. loans to Germany. Germany needed the U.S. loans to pay reparation payments to France and Great Britain, but during the 1920s, the U.S. stock market was booming. By 1928, they began to pull their money out of Germany to invest it in their own stock market. So in October of 1929, when the U.S. stock market crashed, the prices of stocks plunged, and in a panic, U.S. investors withdrew even more funds from Germany and other European markets. This withdrawal weakened the banks of Germany and other European states. The Kreditanstalt Vienna, Switzerland's most famous bank, collapsed in 1931. By then, trade was slowing down, industrial production was declining, and unemployment was rising. Economic depression was by no means new to Europe. However, the extent of this economic downturn after 1929 truly made this a Great Depression. During 1932, the worst year of the Depression, 1 British worker in every 4 was unemployed. 6 million Germans, or 40% of the German labor force, were out of work at the same time. One effect of the economic crisis was increased government activity in the economy. This occurred even in countries that, like the United States, had a strong sense of laissez-faire tradition, which means a belief that the government should not interfere with the economy. Another effect was a renewed interest in Marxist doctrines. Marx predicted that capitalism was going to destroy itself through overproduction, and it seemed like it was coming true. Communism was becoming more popular, especially among workers and intellectuals. The Great Depression led masses of people to follow political leaders who offered really simple solutions in return for dictatorial power. Everywhere democracy seemed on the defense in the 1930s. You can see here how unemployment skyrockets. The unemployment is in red, and almost no matter what, well, in all cases, no matter what country you look at, you can see that unemployment goes through the roof in a short period of time between 1929 and 1932. We're going to have to pause right here because the timer's going to run out. Next, we're going to be talking about Germany, France, Great Britain, and how they responded to all of this.